I solemnly swear that I am up to no good. Welcome, everyone, to a very special episode of Dear Mr. Potter. I'm Alistair Stevens. Tonight we take some time away from Hogwarts to visit with Miss Cackle's Academy for Witches in a shameless, just audacious rip-off of Harry Potter, which somehow had the temerity to be published 20 years before J.K. Rowling published her first novel. Tonight, The Worst Witch by Jill Murphy, published in 1974. Before we get to Mildred Hubble, though, a very quick note. We must honor the day. Today, as I'm recording this, is June the 26th, and 21 years ago today, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone was published in the UK. Readers in the US wouldn't see a copy of Sorcerer's Stone, as it would become, until September of 1998, but June the 26th, 1997 is the first publication date for a Harry Potter series, a series which is now old enough to drink. Paradoxically, here in the US, it has already been drinking in the UK for 3 years. As George Bernard Shaw says, the United States and Great Britain are two countries separated by a common language and a weirdly discordant definition of how old an individual has to be in order to enjoy a refreshing adult beverage. In any case, 21 years of the Philosopher's Stone. Raise a glass to Harry and to Hogwarts. And I'm kind of wishing that I'd poured myself a glass of something before I sat down to start recording the podcast. I didn't, but you can enjoy it on my behalf, and I will, I promise you, make good on the toasting after this live recording is finished. Back then to tonight's topic and The Worst Witch. Let me share with you here the cover. There it is in all its... Well, that sure is some typography, isn't it? This is, I have a distinct memory, the first version of The Worst Witch that I ever read. The Penguin classic, the Penguin version, the Penguin, classic version of The Worst Witch that I read, that I picked up from the shelf of my local lending library in the small village of Fochabers in the northeast of Scotland, right there on the banks of the Spey, very close to the Murray Firth there, when I was maybe 8 years old, maybe 9 years old. I'm thinking it's the late 1980s. Here, the shelves of my local lending library were pretty bereft of engaging stories for a young man of my inquiring mind and adventurous spirit, but I alighted upon the Jill Murphy Worst Witch series and absolutely loved it. There are, as of this moment, 7 books in the Worst Witch series. The Worst Witch, published in 1974. The Worst Witch Strikes Again from 1980. A Bad Spell for the Worst Witch, a deviation from the usual naming convention of this series, which was published in 1982. The Worst Witch All at Sea from 1993. The Worst Witch Saves the Day from 2005. The Worst Witch to the Rescue 2007. And The Worst Witch and the Wishing Star from, brace yourself, 2013. Jill Murphy has not ruled out the possibility of more Worst Witch sequels coming our way in the years to come. When I picked up the series in the late 1980s, of course, there were only the 3 books, the original 3 books, The Worst Witch, Strikes Again, and A Bad Spell, which had been published in 1982. And I distinctly remember thoroughly enjoying the first one. I have no memory of the latter 2 books. I have looked at the covers today and glossed, in fact, the entire text of the follow-up novels today, and I have no memory of them, despite the fact that I do have a memory of reading them, if that makes sense. I have a memory of the artifact, the book of The Worst Witch, but no memory of the story content of The Worst Witch, which is not unusual for the late 1980s, honestly, because of the number of books that I absolutely devoured in that period. We are talking about The Worst Witch, of course, well, because it shares some weird similarities, some odd commonalities, some points of reflection and some points of repetition with J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series. Not because it is a direct inspiration to Harry Potter. J.K. Rowling has said that she has never read The Worst Witch or had never read The Worst Witch by the time that she started writing the Harry Potter series. I am inclined to believe her. If she had read this series, it is unlikely that she would have replicated it so perfectly, so much in its fine detail in the pages in particular of the first Harry Potter series. Rather, I choose to believe that both Jill Murphy's work and J.K. Rowling's work grew from the same rich, shared cultural heritage. I think that both of these books are articulating something that is almost osmotically ubiquitous throughout British children's fiction in the mid-century period. We've talked a little bit about the debt that Harry Potter owes to the boarding school adventure, and that same debt is clearly owed by Jill Murphy's work, specifically and in particular the first Worst Witch novel. Jill Murphy began writing the first novel at the age of 15. This is the quote, which I absolutely adore from Jill Murphy herself. Quote, "My two friends and I used to come home in our dark uniforms looking very scruffy at the end of the day. My dark plaits sprouting tufts with lost hair ribbons. My mum used to say, 'Look at you all, you look like three witches.' And it gave me the idea for a witches' school so that it was exactly like my school but with a subtle touch of magic. All the characters are based on my school friends, brackets, and enemies and teachers." That is the entire creative process behind The Worst Witch, apparently, according to Jill Murphy, which, again, I am inclined to believe this account of the creation of this particular story. It is really quite lovely. It is so naturalistic, so anchored, so grounded, and yet simultaneously so fantastical that it can only be a British children's. I'm hesitating over the qualification here. We would now consider The Worst Witch to be YA fiction. I think that is probably fair to say. It is certainly it's elementary grade here in the US, but bordering on middle grade fiction. It is not for children in the modern sense, but it is certainly juvenile fiction. The boundaries which we erect assiduously around children's fiction have, of course, shifted in the years since the publication of The Worst Witch, certainly, but definitely since the publication of the Harry Potter series too. J.K. Rowling very much redefined what was possible in that YA space, in that juvenile space. So I'm hesitating a little bit over this. I'm going, I think, to refer to The Worst Witch as juvenile fiction rather than children's fiction, even though it would absolutely have been considered children's fiction back when it was originally published. And it is emblematic. It is almost apotheotic. It is almost archetypal of children's fiction of this particular genre published in the 1970s. Not the 1970s specifically, but published in that post-mid-century period when we have already been informed by, well, the great British boarding school tradition, be it Tom Brown or Just William or Billy Bunter or The Girls of St. Trinian's or the Jennings series, which I've only recently begun to dip my toe into and which is actually really rather beguiling. I rather like the Jennings stories. I may talk about them at some point. Maybe in a hiatus after Order of the Phoenix, we'll have the opportunity to talk a little about Jennings, which does share some DNA with the Harry Potter series. And then, of course, the works of Enid Blyton. We can talk about the Famous Five, and we can talk about the Secret Seven, and we can talk about, interestingly, the rather provocative and progressive... Okay. The rather provocative and progressive, in terms of everything but its name, series The Naughtiest Girl, right? There is a series written by Enid Blyton called The Naughtiest Girl, which is all about a girl who grows up spoiled because she is an only child and then who learns to be, cool when she goes to a rather progressive and environmentally minded boarding school. I say rather environmentally minded because it was still, I think the 1940s when The Naughtiest Girl at School was published, and it is still called The Naughtiest Girl, which feels, I don't know, feels weirdly inappropriate, even though it is, of course, entirely appropriate. Perhaps we'll have the opportunity to talk about Enid Blyton at some point in the future. So the point is that both Jill Murphy and J.K. Rowling are representing this very rich seam of British fiction. There's this quintessentially British fiction, these school adventure stories coming from really the beginning of the 19th century all the way through the 20th century, being codified. Really, I suppose the height of the British boarding school adventure is between like 1920 and 1945, I suppose, something like that period. But there is a reaction to the British boarding school adventure, which carries us forward through the 1950s and the 1960s into what we might consider the modern period with the publication of The Worst Witch in 1974. The comparisons, the points of comparison between The Worst Witch and Harry Potter are absolutely legion. It's not just the inclusion of magic, and it's not just the benevolent and somewhat absent-minded, white-haired, bespectacled headmaster / headmistress of the school who takes an odd liking to our protagonist. It's not just the dark-haired and intermittently hook-nosed potions master who takes an immediate dislike to our protagonist. It's not just the blonde-haired rival in the school who comes from old money and old blood. There are so many points of comparison that it is somewhat shocking, in fact, which leads to Reddit threads and Tumblr conversations and Twitter memes and ongoing discourse all over the internet about how awful it is that Netflix has published an original series called The Worst Witch, which is clearly such a blatant ripoff of Harry Potter. Again, more than 20 years before Harry Potter was published, there was Mildred Hubble. The series sold more than 4 million copies, which prior to Harry Potter was a very significant number for children's fiction. In 1986, the first book, the book that we are discussing this evening, was made into a television film of the same name. That is, well, gosh, it's my preferred TV version or my preferred cinematic version of this story. I'm sure that you guys feel the same. I don't want to, make any wild assumptions about where we're all coming from here, but it's the 86 TV movie, right? Like, that's the one that we all like. A TV series based on the books aired from 1998 to 2001 and had two spin-offs, Weird Sister College, which began in 2001, and The New Worst Witch, which aired in 2005. That, I believe, is a co-production between British and Canadian television. And then there was a new series which started airing in January of 2017. This was the CBBC, the children's BBC production, which it's very, very bad is the thing. It's very, very terrible. And I wish that it wasn't very, very terrible, but it is very, very terrible in a way which only a CBBC original production can be very terrible. It is cheap in a way that only an underfunded BBC department can make a cheap TV show. No one else in the world would make a TV show that looks this cheap in 2017. Yeah, it's pretty bad, you guys. Oh, no. Angela's just been watching it over the last couple of days and really liked it. All the girls are adorable. Yeah. You know what? That's fair. There is a fair amount of charm. I don't know why it's being made is my biggest opposition to, well, no, I know why it's being made. It's because The Worst Witch is A, very cheap, and B, potentially very lucrative indeed. So I can understand why it's, okay, there we go. Becca is also taking Angela's side here. Yep, no, that's completely fine. I totally get it. You guys are all pulling against me here, which I can totally understand. And Elizabeth is pointing out that I made the grimace emoji face. Yeah, but you know what? It's absolutely fine that you guys love what you love. I'm so glad, in fact, that you can find the good in it. I did, it's fair to say, tap out most of the way through the first episode because it was so painful. But the first episode also has perilously little to do with the show, with the novel itself, of course, which I just realized is still here on your screens. It's cheap but nostalgic, says Angela. I'll take that. I'm not above a little cheap nostalgia from time to time. Good. Let me see as I scroll back here. Hubblepuff says Wilhelm Scream. You see, that's really interesting. And Becca saying, are we sure JKR didn't accidentally read it and forget? You know what? We can possibly assert that to be true, but I'm not sure that it's worth anything. I think that there's a great quote from Neil Gaiman. In fact, this is relevant to next week's discussion. There's a great quote about Neil Gaiman about some potential crossover between his work and J.K. Rowling's work. And when questioned about this, hey, Neil Gaiman, how do you feel about J.K. Rowling totally ripping you off with the Harry Potter series? His response was, I'm pretty sure that we were both stealing from T.H. White. Which they absolutely were, right? We're going to talk about The Sword and the Stone, the first volume of The Once and Future King, next week here on Dear Mr. Potter. We're going to divide that entire novel, in fact, in half. So we're going to talk about the first half of The Sword and the Stone next week. And that is what I mean when I talk about a rich cultural tradition, right? I've used this word casually a couple times over the course of the last couple of weeks, so I should probably frame it out a little bit. But when we were talking about fine wine, he said, segueing effortlessly into an entirely new topic, when we're talking about fine wine, one of the most important contributory factors to the quality of a given wine isn't the grape itself or the climatic conditions in which that grape grows. It is the soil. It is the terroir. And in this instance, both Murphy, Rowling, Gaiman, every conceivable British fantasy author from like 1970 onward grew up in very similar terroir. They were exposed to the same combination of C.S. Lewis and Enid Blyton, right? These are the two kind of the two pillars here of fantasy and boarding school adventure. So they're both inheriting that same tradition, both refracting that same tradition, both interestingly refracting that same tradition through very similar lenses. There are some biographical similarities between Jill Murphy and J.K. Rowling, which make for interesting points of speculation, I guess. But it is entirely possible that both of these authors have come to this same material, come to what is in effect the same idea. Hey, what if a school but magic? What if British boarding school adventure but also mid-century British fantasy novel? What about that? If you come to that idea, which is a fairly elementary idea in either the early 1970s or the early 1990s, then you are going to end up with very similar stories informed by the cultural landscape of your kind of shared cultural heritage here. Let's get into our book here because, yes, Wilhelm Scream calling up Grant Morrison, who is a writer that I was no kidding, Wilhelm, thinking about today in this very context. Wilhelm Scream says that's exactly what Grant Morrison said when people came to him asking whether he'd ripped off The Matrix, whether he thought The Matrix, ripped off The Invisibles, that they were both working from established genre elements, Gibson, Dick, etc., and dismissed any thought of plagiarism. Grant Morrison is one of the, Grant Morrison, the comic book writer, for those of you who don't know the name, is one of the most capable and complex analysts and deconstructionalists of the creative process that is working in the world today. I think I'm not perhaps the world's biggest Grant Morrison fan. I'm not perhaps the biggest fan of his comic book work in particular, but I can absolutely respect his perspective on the creative act and where these ideas come from, right? A question which J.K. Rowling has pretty resolutely struggled to answer in the many interviews that she has given about the Harry Potter series. And she has struggled to answer that question because that is possibly the world's worst question. Where do you get your ideas? Hey, author of something that I have enjoyed. Hey, director of a movie that I just watched and really liked. Hey, musician who has turned out 4 albums, all of which I have on constant rotation on Spotify. Where do you get your ideas? That's the worst answer, because the only possible answer to that question for the creative individual is by being me, by being all that I am, exposed to the world in all its infinite variety, in all of its comfort and its challenge, in all of its highs and lows, by being the unique combination of me here now. That is where I get my ideas from. Can anyone replicate those ideas? Well, no, not perfectly, not completely, not in their totality, not unless they are also somehow perfectly me, perfectly here, perfectly now. That is where ideas come from. That is where creativity comes from. That is what makes each of us unique. It is that combination of personality and experience and presence in the moment, right? It's not just about who you have been, it is about who you are and who you choose to be in this moment. I am not at all at home to the idea that J.K. Rowling has ripped off Jill Murphy. I'm realizing now, perhaps 25 minutes into this evening's discussion, that I should have stated that more clearly. I am not at all at home to the idea that J.K. Rowling has ripped off Jill Murphy. I'm not at all at home to the idea that J.K. Rowling ripped off anyone. I am inclined to completely believe her, as I completely believe most authors, most creative people, that their act of creativity was performed in good faith, I suppose, that it was an act of creative grace, and that we can take the work, therefore, without any asterisk attending it. Let's get into, gosh, here we are half an hour in, and I wanted tonight to be a shorter session too. Let's get into our discussion of The Worst Witch, shall we? With the beginning. This is the very opening of the book. Let me read this to you. Miss Cackle's Academy for Witches stood at the top of a high mountain surrounded by a pine forest. It looked more like a prison than a school, with its gloomy grey walls and turrets. Sometimes you could see the pupils on their broomsticks flitting like bats above the playground wall, but usually the place was half hidden in mist, so that if you glanced up at the mountain you would probably not have noticed the building was there at all. Everything about the school was dark and shadowy. There were long, narrow corridors and winding staircases, and there were the girls themselves, dressed in black gym slips, black stockings, black hobnailed boots, grey shirts, and black and grey ties. Even their summer dresses were black and grey checked. The only touches of colour were the sashes round their gym slips, a different colour for each house, and the school badge, which was a black cat sitting on a yellow moon. For special occasions, such as prize-giving or Halloween, there was another uniform consisting of a long robe worn with a tall pointed hat, but as these were black too, it didn't really make much of a change. There were so many rules that you couldn't do anything without being told off, and there seemed to be tests and exams every week. Mildred Hubble was in her first year at the school. She was one of those people who always seemed to be in trouble. She didn't exactly mean to break rules and annoy the teachers, but things just seemed to happen whenever she was around. You could rely on Mildred to have her hat on back to front or her bootlaces trailing on the floor. She couldn't walk from one end of the corridor to the other without someone yelling at her, and nearly every night she was writing lines or being kept in. Not that there was anywhere to go if you were allowed out. Anyway, she had lots of friends, even if they did keep their distance in the potion laboratory, and her best friend Maud stayed loyally by her through everything, however hair-raising. They made a funny pair, for Mildred was tall and thin with long plaits, which she often chewed absent-mindedly, another thing she was told off about, while Maud was short and tubby, had round glasses, and wore her hair in bunches. Wilhelm Scream observing here, school colours equals none more black. Yes! This is the introduction to Miss Cackle's Academy for Witches, which is not entirely not Hogwarts, right? I mean, we can gloss some of the similarities here and respect them as interesting details, interesting proofs of spontaneous and simultaneous creativity. Simultaneous, not temporally, I suppose, but simultaneous in terms of that creative impulse. We can respect and honor and be amused by the similarities without necessarily thinking that one book is made less by the addition of those similarities. Miss Cackle's Academy for Witches, completely distinct legally from Hogwarts, of course, stood at the top of a high mountain surrounded by pine forest. It looked more like a prison than a school with its gloomy grey walls and turrets. What we're really noticing here is the same gesture toward medievalism that we see in J.K. Rowling's work. Miss Cackle's Academy is not a lot like Hogwarts. Physically, it is a lot like Hogwarts, right? It is a castle. It is shadowy and it is imposing. It has none of the whimsy or the mystery, I suppose, of Hogwarts, but it is still leaning toward that medievalist impulse that we see in British fantasy authors of this period, particularly juvenile British fantasy authors of this period. The appeal of medievalism and its notion of antiquity and otherworldliness, I suppose, etherealness, eldritchness almost, is clear. This is completely common whether we're talking about The Worst Witch, we're talking about Harry Potter, we're talking about any number of other books too in this kind of tradition. Then we get, before we get to that, another quick note. Usually the place was half hidden in mist, so if you glanced up at the mountain, you would probably not have noticed the building was there at all. In the Worst Witch novels, it seems clear that what is protecting what we've called in the context of Harry Potter, but we're kind of referencing, the White Wolf role-playing games here and Vampire, but we're talking about the Masquerade, right? This idea that the wizarding world is sequestered away from the Muggle world, that seems within the bounds of the Worst Witch to be simply a product of climactic complexity, I suppose. The fact that it was misty, the fact if you glanced up at the mountain you probably wouldn't have noticed the building was there at all, suggests that in fact it is shrouded by convenient geography more than it is shrouded by magic. That is to say that the wizarding world, the Worst Witch version of the wizarding world, is more transparent to the Worst Witch version of the Muggle world than it is like the Harry Potter version of the Wizarding world. It is less concealed, less sequestered here. Marshall's asking me to talk about the White Wolf RPGs. You know what? Someday I will have the opportunity to talk about it, but today is not that day. The Norex is observing, I love Little Witch Academia. Is this picking up from Nikki? I believe that it was Aaron. I believe it was Sosa Sundere who was bringing up Little Witch Academia in the This Week on Point North discussion that we had yesterday. That is clearly a show that I'm going to have to spend some more time with. So we'll definitely come around to that. The Norex also observing, unless you're Foucault, then you think schools and prisons serve the same purpose. Yes, will someday for that discussion too. Most importantly, the thing that really jumped out at me reading this again today was the mention here of schoolhouses. The only touches of color, were the sashes round their gym slips, a different color for each house, and the school badge, which was a black cat sitting on a yellow moon. To the best of my recollection, there is no discussion of the houses of Miss Cackle's Academy for Witches in this series at all. I don't think that it's... The fact that there are schoolhouses is referenced obliquely, I think at the beginning of the second book, I want to say, we get some discussion of schoolhouses, but I don't remember the actual definition of the schoolhouses, and that is not unusual. That doesn't stand out to my reading of this story as a British boarding school adventure or as a story in the British boarding school adventure tradition, because schoolhouses, as we discussed way back when we started Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, are simply a fixture of this kind of British educational institution. The fact that there are schoolhouses attracts no attention at all, and we do not feel compelled to describe them or to differentiate them. Wilhelm screams saying, well, in the fourth book there is the Tri-Witchard tournament. Yeah, I'm going to have to yellow card you on that one, Wilhelm. That's a push there, but yes. Oh, as Seastar also wondering what gym slips are. Are gym slips not an American? You don't use that term here? That's like little black pinafore dresses that you would... Is pinafore dress a thing that you would say here in the United States? I have no idea. I am so far out of my wheelhouse now that I can't even talk about it. Anyway, so we have our school. We have our pupil, Mildred Hubble. You will note here that we really begin in medias res. There is a secret genius to Jill Murphy's work here in the Worst Witch series, which is that each book describes half of an academic year. The academic year at Miss Cackle's Academy for Witches is split into two parts. It is split in half. The winter semester, the winter term, excuse me for my rampant use of an Americanism there, but the winter term and the summer term, or sometimes the spring term. So the first two books occupy the first year for Mildred Hubble at Miss Cackle's Academy. Mildred Hubble was in her first year at the school. She was one of those people who always seemed to be in trouble. She didn't exactly mean to break rules and annoy the teachers, but things just seemed to happen whenever she was around. That is to say, Mildred Hubble is our protagonist. No coincidence, of course, that Hubble rhymes with trouble. A rather pleasing little bit of euphony there, a little mellifluous bit of naming to guide us through this novel. Mildred is Harry without Harry's heroism. And she's not even completely Harry without Harry's heroism. She is more specifically Harry without Harry's exceptionalism. Mildred is, in many ways, just like Harry Potter. And when I say that she is just like Harry Potter, what I mean, of course, is that they are both protagonists of very similar stories. The narrative burden that is placed upon these characters is very similar. Now, of course, Harry is going to grow up in the context of his story. From our privileged perspective, having just finished Goblet of Fire, Harry has already grown up quite significantly. He has grown past Mildred. The shape and the tenor and the tone of his books, and crucially of his character, have exceeded what they were initially established as back in the pages of Philosopher's/Sorcerer's Stone. Mildred is not going to grow up to that same degree, but if we look at Harry at the beginning of Philosopher's Stone and Mildred at the beginning of The Worst Witch, we can see two characters who are, well, magnets for trouble. Now, Harry is a magnet for trouble because of his exceptionalism, because of his in-universe exceptionalism, but he would still be a magnet for trouble even if he wasn't the boy who lived, because he would still have his name on the front of the book, which is a feature that he shares in common, of course, with Mildred. Mildred's name isn't on the cover of the book, but her title definitely is, yes. Oh, wow. As Seastar saying, Mildred reminding me more of Neville, the does everything wrong klutz in this introduction, but unlike Neville, she has a close friend. Ooh, yes, she certainly has a close friend. The introduction of Maud here, really quite charming. Opposing Mildred and Maud, of course, you know, one is tall and thin, one is short and somewhat less thin. Kind of playing into that archetypal point of comparison. Good. Good. All right. Let's move into then our second slide and the introduction of the school song. The presentation took place in the Great Hall, a huge stone room with rows of wooden benches, a raised platform at one end, and shields and portraits all round the walls. The whole school had assembled, and Miss Cackle and Miss Hardbroom stood behind a table on the platform. On the table was a large wicker basket from which came mews and squeaks. First of all, everyone sang the school song, which went like this. Onward, ever striving onward, proudly on our brooms we fly, straight and true above the treetops, shadows on the moonlit sky. Ne'er a day will pass before us when we have not tried our best, kept our cauldrons bubbling nicely, cast our spells and charms with zest. Full of joy we mix our potions, working by each other's side. When our days at school are over, let us think of them with pride. It was the usual type of school song, full of pride, joy, and striving. Mildred had never yet mixed a potion with joy, nor flown her broomstick with pride. She was usually too busy trying to keep upright. First of all, of course, Harry Potter comparisons. Hey, we're in a great hall. The teachers, the faculty of Miss Cackle's Academy, are standing at one end of the great hall looking down at the student body. The student body of Miss Cackle's Academy, interestingly, actually rather more specific and manageable than the student body of Hogwarts, which, as we mentioned before, is, well, kind of a nebulous concept, right? Entire ranks of mathematicians are still trying to figure out how many kids go to Hogwarts at any given moment, but we do know from later books in the series that the student body at Miss Cackle's Academy is around 60 kids, start to finish. The entire student body in the sometimes 4 and sometimes 5 year span of one's education at Miss Cackle's Academy. Roughly 60 kids here, yes. The Netflix series says Angela has no songs and unfortunately no singing Tim Curry. It's so sad. Erica asking, this is really similar to Harry Potter, but isn't it common for large schools like this? Yes, that is exactly the point, Erica. Good job. The presentation took place in the Great Hall, capital G, capital H. There, a huge stone room with rows of wooden benches, a raised platform. Yeah, this is just public school. This is just what schools are like in the UK. Not all schools, of course. This is what paid boarding schools are like in the UK, or at least this is the common post-mid-century kind of appreciation for those kinds of educational institutions. Then we have the school song, not completely dissimilar from the Sorting Hat song that we get back in Philosopher's Stone, or the second Sorting Hat song that we get in Goblet of Fire, but you'll notice how Jill Murphy manages to undercut it beautifully as we come out of the song. The song itself, pretty trite. Like the song itself, very obvious, very flat, very prosaic almost, but the narrative completely undercuts that as we come out. It was the usual type of school song, full of pride, joy, and striving, right? This is Jerusalem, the school version. This is everything that we expect from a school song in the context of a British boarding school. Mildred, she says, the narrative voice says, offsetting Mildred from that traditional boarding school experience, Mildred had never yet mixed a potion with joy, nor flown her broomstick with pride. She was usually too busy trying to keep upright. Mildred is not a part of this stratum of society, I suppose. She is not a part of this particular social class. She is not a part of this contextual experience. She is struggling. She's the worst witch. She's just really trying to survive. She doesn't have the opportunity to mix a potion with pride or to fly her broomstick, to mix a potion with joy, or to fly her broomstick with pride. Though we must, again, note the comparison here. Both... Well, I'm hesitating a little bit, right? Because, of course, the school song that we get from J.K. Rowling isn't quite the same as this school song and is more complete. One of the differences that you'll find looking at The Worst Witch versus Harry Potter is that The Worst Witch is much more self-aware about its tradition, and that makes a lot of sense because that tradition was still much more present and much more urgent in 1974 than, you know, the publication of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone in 1997 in the UK. So there is a difference there. J.K. Rowling doesn't have to be so self-aware about the boarding school adventure tradition. She gets to play some of those tropes straight. After a while, well, tropes never really regain their narrative energy, their narrative fuel, right? This is what differentiates a trope from a cliche. A storytelling element which is so useful that it is repeated becomes a trope. It becomes a narrative device which is consensual, I suppose. We agree that this narrative device has a certain amount of use, a certain amount of internal fuel. It has a certain broad applicability and broad accessibility, so we reuse it. That is what turns a narrative device, a one-shot, singular, unique narrative device, into a trope. It is so useful that we use it over and over and over. Ultimately, tropes become exhausted. That narrative fuel that they contain becomes depleted, and that is the point at which they are transformed into cliches. Now, the tropes of the British boarding school adventure have never, I think, been so exploited that they have turned into cliches, but they are tropes nonetheless. J.K. Rowling, though, from her privileged position 20 years after the publication of The Worst Witch, and more importantly 20 years further out from the boom of the British boarding school adventure, is able to leverage some of those tropes without excusing them. She is able to tell a British boarding school adventure story, a school adventure story, without framing it in quite the way that Jill Murphy chooses to frame it. I'm not even sure that Murphy needed to frame it here in the context of 1974, but she chooses to, and it's much more effective for that. Yeah. Let me see here. I'm missing so much of the chat here. Mildred embodying the fish out of water feeling that most adolescents have, observes Martin. Absolutely right. And that out of step, out of phase, fish out of water experience is, of course, an experience with which we are all directly or tangentially familiar, right? And not in the sense that we usually experience that by proxy, rather that we experience that in an incomplete fashion. We are completely or incompletely the fish out of water ourselves during our adolescent experience, which makes Mildred, of course, enormously empathetic. We can connect with her emotionally right out of the gate. One of the reasons that I pulled this slide is to lay to rest forever, hopefully, any idea that Jill Murphy is not a great writer. Jill Murphy is a fantastic writer. The skill that she displays in the context of The Worst Witch in particular, this first novel in particular, is a little elusive and a little treacherous because she is clearly writing for a very juvenile audience. She is writing for an audience which is much younger than the audience even for Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, so she has to keep her work open and airy and accessible, but there are moments of absolute genius and demonstrated self-awareness, which I really appreciate. Jill Murphy is an excellent writer, and I think that is clear in the context of this book. Nowhere as clear. It is evident nowhere as much as it is evident in this particular sequence, with the somewhat trite school song, which is perfectly pitched, perfectly delivered, and then the undercutting of that, gorgeously done. I think Jill Murphy is extremely good. Yes, good. Wilhelm is asking, how groundbreaking is it that this book features a young woman as the main character in a British boarding school adventure? Actually, not terribly groundbreaking, Wilhelm. You might be surprised to learn. One of the features of the boarding school adventure throughout the 20th century is that it is hardly ever co-ed, right? I mentioned the Naughtiest Girl at School series earlier, the Enid Blyton series. That is distinct because I believe... I'm not questioning this. No, I'm pretty sure, in fact, that Whiteleaf is the institution that the Naughtiest Girl goes to. That Whiteleaf is, in fact, a co-ed institution, but that is very unusual. Most of the stories that we've discussed so far, whether we're talking about the boys' side with Tom Brown or with Bunter or with Jenkins, right, or we're talking about the girls' side with St. Trinians, they are single-sex educational institutions because those are safe. Those are safe in the complicated moral landscape of the of British literature in the pre-war, post-war, mid-century period. It is not entirely unusual, therefore, for the protagonist of one of these stories to be female. It is unusual for the protagonist of one of these stories to be female in the context of a co-ed school. When we are talking about a co-ed school, we almost always resort, as we do in the Harry Potter series, to a male protagonist. There are counterexamples. As I said, the Naughtiest Girl series is one of those. I don't recommend the Naughtiest Girl series, by the way. It's not terribly good. Like, you can get everything that you would get from that book from a gloss of the Wikipedia page. Basically, the fact that she is spoiled as a product of her upbringing rather than a product of her character, that is wildly progressive by the standards of the Enid Blyton originals. Another author whose name, forgive me, I almost had it there for a second. No, another author whose name eludes me. Perhaps one of you can access Wikipedia while we are talking here. Another author wrote, I believe, 6 Naughtiest Girl stories in the aftermath of Enid Blyton's original 4 Naughtiest Girl stories. But yeah, it's pretty tricky. Marshall's observing here, co-ed boarding schools were pretty rare in mid-century England, right? I recall C.S. Lewis's narrator specifically mentioning that Jill and Eustace's school in the Silver Chair was unusual for that, among other reasons. Absolutely correct, yes. In terms of boarding schools, co-ed schools are, I would dare say, still in a minority, though of course the tradition for boarding schools has lapsed. But there are still boys schools and girls schools in England. Yes, Jackie saying, having been to an all-girls school, I can't say I recommend it. Anne Digby, thank you so much, Wilhelm Scream. Anne Digby wrote some more Naughtiest Girl stories after Enid Blyton stopped and was apparently celebrated. I think that those are generally recognized as being very much in line with Enid Blyton's voice, but maybe even more politically progressive. It's an interesting space. Perhaps I'll have to revisit those. Yeah. Okay. Let's. So yes, not terribly. Mildred is not terribly. Terribly groundbreaking, not terribly progressive, because she is a female protagonist, because we have this tradition of all girls schools going back to back to Centrinians. Centrinians may have been the big breakout hit in terms of all-girls schools, but I'm sure that there were other schools preceding those. Yeah, good. Where the school, I should say, is the focus of our attention. Obviously, there are boarding school passages in the serialized novels of the 19th century, even going back to Jane Eyre, I suppose, right? You can have boarding school passages, boarding school experiences in those moments, but the shift into the adolescent experience when we get to the boarding school adventure in the 19th century is a marked and distinct one. Yeah, good. All right, let's continue onward to, well, another famous beat here, another archetypal beat, I suppose. This is when Mildred inadvertently transforms Ethel, our antagonist, right? Or our antagonist is the wrong word. I suppose rival would be a better word here to describe. Our Draco Malfoy is basically the deal with Ethel. Mildred has inadvertently turned Ethel into a pig and is trying to cover up for her mistake because the morality of one's action is distinct in the context of the worst witch. The morality of one's action has no external frame. It has no external referent. It is only defined as a moral or an immoral act, depending on whether or not one is caught by the faculty of Miss Cackle's Academy for Witches. This very much in common with Harry Potter, particularly there in the first book. Yes, C-Star pointing out, Ethel is the bullying rival like Malfoy, but good at everything like Hermione. That's interesting. You're right. That is a powerful distinction between Draco Malfoy and Ethel here. Is that Ethel is the superlative character. She's just better than Mildred at everything. Yeah, that's really good. That's a good observation, C-Star. Thank you for that. Let's take a look at this slide. Ethel, dear, she whispered coaxingly into the pig's ear. Will you go out when I tell you to? Please, Ethel. I'll let you in again straight away afterwards. Pleading with people like Ethel never works. It only makes them feel their power. I won't go, bellowed the pig. Miss Hardbroom, I am Ethel. Mildred Hubble turned me into a pig. Nothing ever surprised Miss Hardbroom. Even this startling piece of news only caused her to raise one slanting eyebrow. Well, Mildred, she said, I'm glad to know that you have at least learned one thing since you came here. However, as you will have noticed in the Witch's Code, Rule number 7, paragraph 2, it is not customary to practice such tricks on your fellows. Please remove the spell at once. I'm afraid I don't know how to, Mildred confessed in a very small voice. Miss Hardbroom stared at her for a few moments. Then you had better go and look it up in the library, she said wearily. Take Ethel with you and on your way drop in and tell Miss Bat why Ethel will be late. Miss Bat, by the way, in the 86 TV movie, played by the brilliant Una Stubbs, who we mentioned pretty recently in the patron-exclusive Point North Media book club discussion of Sherlock, of course. Una Stubbs, national treasure, as I've said before, off screen, kind of half-quoting Monty Python here. She turned me into a pig! I got better! From Holy Grail, of course. Yes, Ethel will get better, but she's not better yet. A couple of again, really interesting lines that we can pull out here, which act as signposts for our understanding of the Worst Witch, for our understanding of the British boarding school fantasy adventure, for our understanding of Harry Potter when we finally get to that 20 years from now, from the perspective of the Worst Witch. Pleading with people like Ethel never works. It only makes them feel their power. People like Ethel, people who distinguish themselves as being superior. This is one of the ways in which Ethel is a reflection of a stand-in for a similar archetype to one Draco Malfoy. Of course, Ethel is naturally superior. Now, we might argue that Ethel is actually literally more superior than Draco Malfoy is. Draco Malfoy, by all accounts, is a pretty unexceptional student at Hogwarts and a pretty reprehensible human being. Ethel, well, she doesn't like Mildred, perhaps. She is not quite so utterly reprehensible as Draco Malfoy, but she is at least an exceptional student. She holds herself above her fellows, above her peers here at the Academy, but that makes them feel their power. Pleading with people like Ethel never works. It only makes them feel their power. Mildred subordinates herself here to Ethel. She makes herself voluntarily submissive to Ethel, and in so doing invites Ethel to feel her power, to manifest her power, which in this particular instance, of course, is telling tales. It's tattling. It's what we used to call in the northeast of Scotland, cliping. I don't know. I've never really looked up the etymology of cliping. I have no idea if cliping is a word that is commonly used even throughout other parts of Scotland. But in the northeast of Scotland, to be a clipe, to tell tales, is one of the worst playground sins, of course. Then we get Miss Hardbroom, our stand-in for Severus Snape, old HB as she is referred to here. Again, another example of, strong seeds grown in a very specific soil. If you are going to oppose a character like Mildred Hubble, if you're going to oppose a character like Harry Potter, ultimately, again, Harry Potter stripped of his exceptionalism, stripped of the title The Boy Who Lived, and just made a boy who repeatedly gets into trouble during his first year at wizard school. Harry and Mildred have a certain commonality there, a certain shared DNA there. If you were going to oppose those figures, you oppose them naturally, intuitively, with a figure of authority. You oppose them with someone who is very precise and ordered and diligent. And that precise, ordered, diligent nature may not inspire them to teach charms or chanting in the context of Miss Cackle's, of course, but rather potions. This is speaking to that literary tradition of alchemy and of the natural philosopher, I suppose. We're leaning into these same ideas, which means that Miss Hardbroom and Severus Snape are, well, not entirely distinct characters, right? They could be at least cousins. They share a lot of similarities there. Yes. Take Ethel with you, and on your way, drop in and tell Miss Bat why Ethel will be late. Of course, Snape would have taken points from. Oh, Martin is calling out here, etymological nerdery. Ethel is also Old English and means noble. It absolutely does. Yes. I'm saying, so wait, a clipe is a snitch. Yes, of course. Snitch also used in almost exclusively American English. I don't know that snitch has... I'm trying now to think if snitch predated its American usage to mean a teller of tales or in any case, yes, a clipe. Oh, good. Karen's looking it up. This is great. Scottish clipe is from the Old English clipian, to call. That's fascinating. How wonderful. Good. Okay. I wonder if that's an etymological chain, if that's a inherited meaning, or if that's Old English. It probably would be, actually. In the Northeast, that would make a lot of sense, because in the Northeast we have some very, very complicated linguistic issues to deal with in the Northeast. If you're ever really bored and you want to look up the language of the land from which I hail, go look up Doric specifically. Doric Scots is a very interesting linguistic tributary, I suppose, that you can find in the Northeast of Scotland. A kind of... almost a kind of pidgin English. It's fascinating. Anyway, you can go and look that up if you are so inclined. Karen, I believe that you probably are. Yes. Marshall observing, so early Quidditch evolved from a bunch of Scottish wizards beating up on whoever ratted them out. You know what? Yes. I'm pretty sure that that's the case, actually. And I'm sure that J.K. Rowling, of course, Scottish herself, would agree. Let's move onward and talk about Miss Cackle, who, again, if Miss Hardbroom, if HB is... as HB is to Severus Snape, so Miss Cackle is to one Albus Dumbledore. Miss Cackle was small and very fat, with short grey hair and green horn-rimmed glasses, which she usually wore pushed up on the top of her head. She was the exact opposite of Miss Hardbroom, being absent-minded in appearance and rather gentle by nature. The girls were not in the least bit afraid of her, whereas Miss Hardbroom would reduce any of them to a miserable heap with just one word. Miss Cackle used a different technique. By always being friendly and pleased to see a pupil in her office, she made them feel embarrassed if they had something unpleasant to tell her, as Mildred nearly always had. Mildred knocked at Miss Cackle's door, hoping she would be out. She wasn't. "Come in!" called the familiar voice from inside. Mildred opened the door and went in. Miss Cackle, glasses on her nose for once, was busily writing in a huge register. She looked up and peered over her spectacles. "Ah, Mildred," she said pleasantly. "Come and sit down while I finish filling in this register." Again, if you are going to oppose Mildred/Harry with an authority figure, you do it with HB/SS, right? With Severus Snape in the context of Hogwarts. If you are going to ally your protagonist with a figure of authority, which is absolutely necessary in order to limit the egregious overstepping of authority by your antagonist figure, then you do so in the context of a figure of greater authority, a headmaster or headmistress. And we lean there into, again, a much, much older archetypal tradition in this instance. We are going to, as I mentioned earlier, talk about T.H. White's The Sword and the Stone next week on Dear Mr. Potter. and we're going to have the opportunity to talk about Merlin. We're going to have the opportunity to talk about the oldest wizarding archetype, the wizarding archetype which has absolutely informed Dumbledore and absolutely informed Gandalf and absolutely informed innumerable wizards besides. When you think of a wizard, you think of Merlin first, or someone who is at least, I guess, 70% Merlin by volume. You know, you've got to check that MBV on the bottom of your wizarding label just to make sure that you're getting the authentic experience. We're going to be talking about Merlin in the context of T.H. White's The Sword and the Stone next week, but here we see Miss Cackle also inheriting that Merlinian characteristic. She is affable, she is avuncular, she is likable, but also absent-minded and somewhat otherworldly. As Joseph says here in the chat, wizard great-great-grandfather. Merlin equals wizard great-great-grandfather. Absolutely right. And Angela observing chaos versus order. That's fascinating. Yes, I think that there's a... It's chaos versus order, yes. Crucially, one of the things that we see in this particular instantiation of chaos versus order, which I completely agree, Angela, is the thematic framework to contrast Dumbledore and Snape, or if you like, Dumbledore and McGonagall even, or Cackle and HB, Cackle and Hardbroom here in the context of The Worst Witch. One of the associations that we're making with chaos here is a kind of juvenile irrepressibility, a kind of juvenile irresponsibility, I suppose, which is manifested fascinatingly in both the context of The Worst Witch and the context of Harry Potter by the headmaster/headmistress's preoccupation with sweets. They are both complexly and incompletely juvenile characters. They preserve their organic and mutable interaction with the chaotic impulse, or at least that interaction with the chaotic impulse is mediated through a kind of open-hearted and open-minded juvenile aspect, I suppose, which I find completely fascinating. It is fascinating that both Murphy and Rowling have kind of taken this impulse and extrapolated it out to its logical conclusion, to its logical late 20th century conclusion, right? I think both Dumbledore and Miss Cackle work really rather beautifully. They are, of course, distinct too, or at least Murphy is making textual here something which is left as a potential subtext in the context of Harry Potter, right? Miss Cackle used a different technique. By always being friendly and pleased to see a pupil in her office, she made them feel embarrassed if they had something unpleasant to tell her, as Mildred nearly always had. I'm not angry, you understand. I'm just disappointed. This is textually a part of Miss Cackle's teaching technique. Is this a part of Dumbledore's teaching technique? Well, yes, I think so. I don't think that it is consciously so. I don't think that he is deliberately, I don't think that he has cultivated this avuncular and affable persona in order to make irresponsible children and to make rule breakers and troublemakers uncomfortable in his presence. But I do think that that is a consequence of his presence. It seems to be much more authentic there. But yes, Martin is pointing out that Saruman is your wizard racist uncle. Yes, if this is so right. Okay, wait a minute. So, Nikki says, if Gandalf is wizard dad, this is a reference to the There and Back Again series, in which, of course, we're moving through the works of Professor Tolkien. Nikki says, if Gandalf is wizard dad, what is Merlin? Erica responds, wizard grandpa. Marshall also responds, wizard grandpa. I completely agree, by the way. Joseph confirms that Radagast the Brown would be our wizard drunk uncle, and Martin observes that Saruman would be our wizard racist uncle. Yeah, I kind of like that. C-Star saying, when was Radagast drunk? No, that's fair. We don't know that Radagast is drunk. By the way that Radagast goes native, it is also possible that Radagast is your inhaler of certain medicinal herb uncle, I suppose, right? Radagast, excuse me, knows where to get that the dank nugs. Like Radagast knows how to really relax, which is, of course, a thing that is taken to utter absurdity in the context of the Peter Jackson Hobbit trilogy, where he adapts the well, I guess we even get a little preface of this in the Lord of the Rings trilogy too. Pipeweed is just tobacco, you guys, in the context of the Lord of the Rings. I've said this before in the There and Back Again show, but now I get the opportunity to talk about it here in the frame of Dear Mr. Potter 2. Yes, exactly right. As Nikki says, Radagast is the crazy hippie uncle. Yes, he is. Probably loaded with conspiracy theories about fluoride in the water, right? Like he probably has a lot of thoughts about how the CIA is tracking him. Yeah, I'm kind of into that. Good. Oh no, Seastar is saying, my inhaler of certain medicinal herb uncle is a jerk to my mom, though I love him anyway. Seastar families are complicated and oftentimes suck. I'm terribly sorry for that. That's a tough burden to bear. Right, let's keep moving onward here. I was thinking that tonight's session was going to run an hour, and here we are at an hour, so I guess we're going to run a little longer than an hour. Who would have guessed that from a session of Dear Mr. Potter? The day before Halloween, Miss Hardbroom lined up her class in the yard to give them a few final words of advice. This, I should say, interrupting the flow of the slide, is in the context of the broom flying performance, the flying performance. Broom flying, I suppose, is tautological and reductive, but the flying performance that is going to be performed by the first year students in order to celebrate Halloween at Miss Cackle's. The day before Halloween, Miss Hardbroom lined up her class in the yard to give them a few final words of advice. I'm very pleased with you girls, she said almost pleasantly. Now you will be wearing your best robes tomorrow, so I hope they will be clean and pressed. As she said this, she caught sight of Mildred's broomstick. Mildred, why is there a bundle of sticky tape in the middle of your broomstick? I'm afraid I broke it in half during the first week of term, admitted Mildred. Ethel giggled. I see, said Miss Hardbroom. Well, you certainly can't use that one in the display. Ethel, I seem to remember you have a spare one. Perhaps you could lend it to Mildred? Oh, Miss Hardbroom, cried Ethel. It was given to me as a birthday present. I shouldn't want anything to happen to it. Miss Hardbroom fixed Ethel with one of her nastiest looks. If that is how you feel, Ethel, she said in icy tones, then, oh, I didn't mean I wouldn't lend it, Miss Hardbroom, Ethel said meekly. I'll go and fetch it now. And she ran into the school. Ethel had never forgotten the time Mildred had turned her into a pig, and as she made her way up the spiral staircase, she suddenly thought of a marvellous way of taking her revenge. Ethel really wasn't a nice person at all. Little moral lesson parenthetically delivered to us at the end of that slide. It's pretty cute. The mending of the broomstick with sticky tape, with sellotape, with spellotape, right, depending on how specific you're being here, is of course another nice point of reference back to Harry Potter. The flying on the broomsticks, of course, I mean, barely even merits mentioning in terms of a point of comparison between the two series. But much more importantly, here we see the variable tone of The Worst Witch. The Worst Witch, because it is a much more juvenile book, because it is aimed at a much younger audience, even than the first Harry Potter book, tends to be very soft and very fluffy, and nothing terribly terrible happens to Mildred or her companions through the course of their academic life at Miss Cackle's Academy. But we are about to pull a classic Harry Potter trick. We are about to modulate our tone. We are about to encounter a very kind of commonplace school prank type of misadventure, and then use that as a springboard to move into something much more purposeful, much more, well, a much more higher stakes conflict, I suppose, though not quite there. Yes. Wilhelm Scream saying, I must reluctantly admit that Miss Hardbroom seems to me to be a character in a Harry Potter parody intended for a much more adult audience. I can pursue that no further, except to say, yeah, I see it too. Hardbroom? Yes. No, I see it too. Seastar saying, they knew Mildred was using Ethel's broom. How did they not suspect Ethel when the broom spectacularly malfunctioned? Because they go no deeper into it than that. We need Mildred to feel exiled, as Harry so often feels exiled from his community in the first couple of books, right? This is kind of a major turning point in both Philosopher's Stone and in Chamber of Secrets, and then ultimately much more powerfully in Azkaban too, even in Goblet of Fire, right? Harry resolutely, once a year, Harry feels like he's on the outs with his school community, and Mildred is going to have exactly that experience, though she's going to get through it before Christmas even. So she's just much more advanced than Harry, I think, is what we're learning here. So Ethel goes to fetch the broom, of course, plotting her revenge. The account that we get of this is completely textually transparent, which is something that we will do for the benefit of young readers so that they can follow A, the action of the plot, and B, the moral consequence and the moral culpability for the actions which take place. We don't want our young readers thinking that Mildred is in any way responsible for what happens at the display and the demonstration. In fact, we're going to skip over the display and the demonstration. Absolutely, you're right. Mildred is framed. She's framed, I tells you, and she flees from Miss Cackle's Academy. She actually packs up her stuff and takes it a step further than Harry ever does, or has taken it so far, I suppose, and actually leaves school. She runs away from home here, which leads us to the scene in the forest. Sitting in the clearing in the gloom were about 20 witches, all crowded together, muttering and talking in low voices. Mildred crept nearer and listened. She didn't recognize any of them. A tall, grey-haired witch got to her feet. "Listen, everyone," said the grey-haired witch. "Will you all be quiet for a few minutes? Thank you. Now, what I should like to know is, are we quite sure they will all be sleeping, or at least in their rooms?" She sat down, and another witch got up to reply. She was a small, plump witch with green horn-rimmed glasses. For a horrible moment, Mildred thought it was Miss Cackle, but her voice was different when she spoke. "Of course we are sure," this witch replied. "The morning after Halloween celebrations, the entire school sleeps until midday. It is a rule, and the school is very strict about rules, so no one will be up until 5 minutes to 12 at the very earliest. If we fly over the wall into the back part of the yard, we will be far away from the bedrooms as we can be, and no one will possibly hear us. Added to this, we shall all be invisible, and we shall all be extremely well protected. Then all that remains to be done is to split up, sneak into each room, and turn all of them into frogs. They won't be able to see us even if they are awake. Remember to take one of the boxes with you for the frogs." She pointed to a neat pile of small cardboard boxes. "We can't have even one of them escaping. Once this is done, the entire school and everyone in it will be under our control." The green horn-rimmed glasses are making me think of Rita Skeeter, which is an unpleasant association. But this is our introduction, our last minute, higher scale, higher stakes, but still pretty small scale, small stakes introduction to a larger plot for the conclusion of this, the first book in the Worst Witch series. The specifics of this plot are a little thin. They're a little thin just within the bounds of the Worst Witch, never mind points of comparison between the Worst Witch and the Harry Potter series. But if we look not at the detail of this plot and instead at the shape, the geometry, the topology of this plot, I suppose, we can see similarities between the Worst Witch and Harry Potter. We can see archetypal similarities in the experience of the exiled trouble magnet protagonist, right? Both Mildred and Harry are focal points for negative attention at their particular educational institutions, right? Mildred is trouble and gets in trouble. Harry is trouble for slightly different reasons, but still trouble nonetheless, and gets in trouble. And then we get the turning point, where exiled from their communities, liberated from the bounds of their school experience, whether literally, as is the case with Mildred, or metaphorically and in terms of authority and duty in the case of Harry in Philosopher's Stone, in Chamber of Secrets, in Prisoner of Azkaban, in Goblet of Fire, and so on and so forth through the entire series. However, we are liberated from the strictures, we are liberated nonetheless, and that allows us to interface with the grander plot in a more direct and purposeful fashion, allowing Mildred to save the school. And to save the school, we must note, in a very Harry Potter style beat. Miss Cackle sat down heavily in her chair and looked first into the box and then at Mildred. "Mildred," she said in dramatic tones, "I am still suffering from my public humiliation last night. Because of you, the reputation of the school now lies in the mud, and yet you expect me to believe an incredible story like this?" "But it's true," cried Mildred. "I can even describe some of them. One was tall and thin with thick grey hair, and there was another who looked just like you, Miss Cackle, if you'll excuse me being so personal. She had green horn-rimmed glasses." "Wait a moment," said Miss Cackle, pushing her own glasses onto her nose. "Did you say she had horn-rimmed glasses and looked like me?" "Yes, Miss Cackle," replied Mildred, blushing. "Green ones. I'm sorry if you thought I was being rude." No, child, it isn't that," said Miss Cackle, peering into the box again. Then she turned to Miss Hardbroom. "Do you know, I think the girl may be right after all. The person whom she described sounds exactly like my wicked sister Agatha, who has always been extremely jealous of my position at this academy. Let me explain the plot to you, Miss Hardbroom, here toward the end of the book." Mildred's righteous honesty here, her righteous honesty in the face of suspicion and, well, a kind of inherited dubious quality, I suppose, is very like Harry's self-righteousness at the end of his adventures too, particularly in the course of his first 2 years. Harry is a hero, and even when he is exiled from his community, and even when he has earned, even by extension, even by inference, the distrust of the faculty of Hogwarts, he is still true. He is still heroically self-righteous, as Mildred is here. And we get this lovely reconnection here. Nikki pointing out, ironically, the name Agatha means good woman. Yes, and Joseph Shannon saying, in my crossover fanfic, Ethel and Malfoy go to Cotillion together. Wow. They'd get along famously, wouldn't they? They'd get along famously, though, as has been pointed out, in some ways, Ethel and Malfoy, Ethel at least more of a Hermione. But, you know, I kind of think that Draco Malfoy would love to be a Hermione, given the opportunity. Just would love that. So this is where we get the reveal, and we get, of course, this classic Dumbledorian turn from Miss Cackle as she takes the information, transposes the information in a really interesting way, turns to Miss Hardbroom and says, "Do you know, I think that this is the plot of the story." And then we respond to it. Then we get the conclusion of the story, which is not Unlike Dumbledore awarding an infeasible number of points to Gryffindor just because he feels like it, everyone stood up as Miss Cackle came in, followed by Miss Hardbroom and all the other teachers. "You may sit down, girls," said the headmistress. "As you all know, the school narrowly escaped invasion this morning. Had it not been for a certain young member of the school, we should not be here, but would be hopping about, turned into frogs." The girls laughed. "No, no, girls, do not laugh. It would not be at all funny if it had happened. However, as it did not happen, I proclaim the rest of today a half-holiday in honor of Mildred Hubble. Mildred, would you come up here for a moment?" Mildred went bright red and was pushed to her feet. She stumbled through the rows of chairs, tripping over feet as she went, and clumped across the platform to Miss Cackle's table. "Now don't be shy, my dear," said Miss Cackle, beaming. She turned to the school. "Come along, school! 3 cheers for our heroine, Mildred!" Mildred blushed and twisted her fingers behind her back as the cheers rang out. It was a relief to the heroine when it was all over. As they filed out of the hall, she was thumped on the back and congratulated by everyone, except for Ethel, who gave Mildred the nastiest look you've ever seen. Of course, in the movie adaptation, Miss Cackle would storm across the Great Hall and demand to know if Mildred had put her name in the Goblet of Fire, but that's a discussion for another time. C-Star saying, "Protagonist foils nefarious plot and is lauded by authorities, aka juvenile fiction, the plot structure." You're absolutely right, C-Star. This is the beat, as Angela says, and all is forgiven. All is excused, interestingly, right? We don't even have that acknowledgement that Mildred has done the wrong thing by running away from the academy. Rather, it is kind of smoothed over. It is all but ignored. Yes, Erica says, "I need some clarification. Is this half holiday mean that it's not as important as a full holiday, or is it because everyone sleeps until noon, so it is only the second half is a holiday?" I would take it to be the latter. Yes, it is a half holiday. It's not that the whole day is half as important as a regular holiday. It is half the day is a full holiday, if that makes sense. Why does she award a half holiday? Just because the school has avoided this invasion, which seems like a very provocative word to be used here. It's a first year appropriate. It's a Mildred Hubble appropriate celebration. Yes, I think that because we have resolved the problem, let's declare today a half holiday. No more classes for the rest of the day. No more tests for the rest of the day, despite the rigorous academic standards that we find here at Miss Cackle's Academy. The rest of the day we can just relax. And Nikki's saying because they don't have chocolate. That's why. A very good point, Nikki, as ever. That, you guys, is The Worst Witch. I'm going to wrap up here because I did want tonight to be a shorter session. So let's just look forward to next week's session. Next week, chapters 1 through 12 of The Sword and the Stone by T.H. White, published in 1938. I read 2/3, 3/4 of this book over the course of the last couple of days, and wow, I had forgotten how utterly charming T.H. White's book is, how utterly charming his prose is, how lovely Wirt is. We're studying The Sword and the Stone. For those of you who aren't familiar, we'll gloss this a little bit at the beginning of next week, because amidst the sea of possible influences over J.K. Rowling in the creation of Harry Potter, and amidst the terroir, amidst the cultural osmosis which led to certain archetypal elements emerging in Harry Potter organically and naturally, and I dare say inevitably, there are a few texts which J.K. Rowling acknowledges outright. Some of those are more convincing than others. She acknowledges, for example, the influence of C.S. Lewis and the Narnia books over Harry Potter. And I would love to sit down with J.K. Rowling and ask her what exactly she means, what exactly she is talking about, because it seems to me that there's very little commonality, very little similarity, obviously very little literal similarity between the Narnia books and the Harry Potter books, but also very little thematic commonality. In fact, I might be inspired, I might be inclined to put Narnia at one end of a possible spectrum and Harry Potter at the other end of a possible spectrum, particularly if that spectrum is labeled the importance of faith in being a good person. We'll maybe talk about that at some future juncture if we ever get the opportunity to talk about C.S. Lewis's Narnia novels. So for all that J.K. Rowling has professed certain specific influences which are more or less convincing, I suppose, in my understanding of Harry Potter and my understanding of the texts to which she refers, she does credit T.H. White's The Sword in the Stone as a primary influence over Harry specifically. That is to say that Arthur Wirt in The Sword in the Stone is a direct precedent, sets a direct precedent for Harry Potter in the Harry Potter series. I can absolutely see that. We are going to talk about that next week. Then we're going to conclude it the following week. We'll do the first 12 chapters next week, the latter half of the book, the last 12 chapters the following week. And then we're going to begin with Order of the Phoenix, you guys. It is just a couple of weeks away. I'm very, very excited to get to it. That, though, is going to do it for our discussion of The Worst Witch. I thoroughly enjoyed reading this novel again. I find Murphy's prose to be... I almost inadvertently stopped the broadcast there instead of cancelling the slide to come back to you. I enjoy Jill Murphy's prose a great deal. I think that she is extraordinarily deft and light on her feet. She writes to a juvenile audience without in any way patronizing that juvenile audience, but she does condescend to that juvenile audience in the best possible sense. She is open and engaging, both engaging and engaged, and accessible to that juvenile audience. And I would urge all of you, if you are listening to this podcast just because it's the next podcast in the Dear Mr. Potter feed and you haven't yet read The Worst Witch, if you have children, I don't think that The Worst Witch necessarily stands up to an initial reading as an adult. Perhaps some of you here in the live chat will disagree with me. Perhaps some of you listening to the podcast after the fact will disagree with me and will email pointnorthmedia@gmail.com to tell me how much you enjoyed it as an adult. But I do think that The Worst Witch absolutely stands up as a great example of children's literature, and I recommend it to any young men, young women who are inclined toward the fantastical and educational simultaneously. I think you can definitely read The Worst Witch to them even now in 2018. I think it stands up beautifully, and I think it's a lovely piece of work. That, you guys, is going to do it. Oh, C-Star asking, what time is the next session? Another evening session next week, 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central. That will be, I just realized, you're right, I didn't add the date to the slide there. Oh, July the 3rd, of course. So some of you may not be able to make it next week because you'll be celebrating American independence early. I hope that you can. I hope that you will be able to make it to next week's session. That will be 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, July the 3rd. We'll be able to talk then about the first half of The Sword in the Stone, the following week, the second half of The Sword in the Stone, which means that we will be beginning Order of the Phoenix on July the 17th, Tuesday, July the 17th, probably another evening session there. I think the 10th, July the 10th, we'll try for an afternoon session. We'll try for a Europe-friendly 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central time zone. But next week, 10 p.m. Eastern, 9 p.m. Central, I hope you'll be able to join me for that discussion. Thank you for joining me for this discussion of The Worst Witch. I will talk to you all again very soon. Until then, you guys, take care. Mischief managed. Good night.